Modern Husbands podcast, where we share ideas from experts to manage money and the home as teammates. Today's topic is how your job can make you a better parent or spouse. Our guest is Dr. Perry-Jenkins. She is the author of Work Matters: How Parents' Jobs Shape Children's Well-Being. Her current research examines the work and family experience of blue-collar families. Dr. Perry-Jenkins will discuss how stress impacts us as parents and spouses and what we can do about it. Dr. Perry-Jenkins serves as the Department Chair of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her latest work has been highlighted in the Harvard Business Review and Washington Post, among other publications. Enjoy the show. Dr. Perry-Jenkins, thanks so much for joining us today.
Surely. Thanks for having me.
We're thrilled. We ran across your research in the Harvard Business Review, and which has developed into a book, Work Matters: How Parents' Jobs Shape Children's Well-Being. And initially, when I saw it, I realized, wow, our listeners would love this. And then when we shared it on our company LinkedIn channel, there were lots of reposts because obviously people in the world of work, particularly in dual income households where you have to be thoughtful of your stress levels so you can be a great spouse and a great parent, they also thought this to be very useful as well. So I want to dive into that, and I promised our listeners that we're going to dive into that and understand, is this research something that's potentially applicable to spouses as well? So we know that it was based on parents, but is this applicable to spouses? So we'll get to that.
Okay.
But before we do, can you perhaps share a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. Actually, I'm currently the chair of the psych department at UMass Amherst. I got my PhD in human development and family studies from Penn State, and spent a few years at the University of Illinois. And since then, my career has been as a psych professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
Okay, so if there's a football game on, do you root for Illinois or Penn State when they're playing each other?
Penn State.
Okay. And,
I went there as a student. It's different,
It is. Yeah. And the odds would be in your favor at Penn State
exactly.
as well. So what caused you to dive into this research, to tackle this issue?
It's a very good question. And I started this work actually a long time ago as a graduate student, interested in power and relationships, actually, and interested in, before people even had kids, sort of division of labor and what people were doing. And then as I'm a developmentalist and do longitudinal work, and lo and behold, lots of the folks that we were studying started having children. And you started seeing a whole other set of issues and dynamics and decision-making and problem solving happening. And as that was all playing out, and there's just a lot of work on work and family that tends to focus on just work is this thing out here, and then how does it come over and affect families? And I really got interested in what about work? Not just hours and schedules, but what happens there? How does it shape a human's development in that context? And how does that then shape what happens at home and vice versa? So the book is really digging into less about the things often people like I myself study, which is family leave and sick times, time away from work. We spend a lot of time studying how we get time and policies, and that's obviously important. But, people still spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week at a place that shapes who they are, for better or for worse, that then comes home. And we don't spend a lot of time understanding what it is about that workplace that's good or bad, that's negative or positive, that creates different emotions and feelings that then come home. So that's what this research is about, and looking at over time. So what are the long-term implications of this for kids?
It's almost bizarre that this hasn't been researched before.
Well, it's hard to do when you're really looking at, because, we actually started when people were pregnant, and we followed them through their first year, because I was originally interested in what happens when you have your first baby and you have to go back to work 12 weeks after having a baby, because that's all the leave that you have. Or for many of our families, they were back 2 or 3 weeks because they couldn't afford unpaid leave. What happens to couples, to parents, to infants during that critical first year when everything's hitting the fan at the same time and you're back at work 3 weeks? You haven't even recovered physically from birth and you're back at work. So I was really started off being interested in that first year And then we got another grant to say, well, let's look at the long-term implications. So what we've really looked at is sort of what about that first year, about work, about leave, about relationships, about mental health, which then have a long-term effect on kids 6 years down when they're going into first grade.
And can you walk us through what the research process looked like on your end, just for the layperson who's a listener who doesn't know a lot about how research is conducted?
Yeah, so this research was done with all working class, pretty much lower income families, but I think the processes we identified would fit any kind of family, actually. But we basically recruited over 300 families when they were pregnant, their first child. And we followed them. We interviewed them in their homes individually, moms and dads. If there was a dad there, moms alone. If there was no mom, mom and her mom, if that was who the parents were. About 2 to 3 hour interviews at 5 times across the first year of parenthood. And during that time, we also did some observational interactions with infants, mothers and fathers interacting with their babies, sort of what that looked like. We got reports from folks outside of the family about sort of kids' behaviors. And then we went back as the kids were transitioning into the first grade and looked at what about that first year, if anything, predicted how these kids were doing as they entered the first grade. And so that's pretty much, so this all along the way, we were publishing papers that were sort of what was happening in the first few months, what was happening a year out. And then the book takes us all the way up to when the kids are going into the first grade and the implications of work.
And when you talk about in the research, how it does impact eventually learning. Before we get to that, I just want to make sure that we set the stage. So when you're sharing your findings, can you explain the difference between a control group and a treatment group? Just so folks understand, hey, these are very similar groups with just, this specific thing is different.
So let me explain. So this study was not one group had a good work condition and one group didn't, that would be a great experimental design, but you can't pick when people are pregnant and you can't decide when, or what kind of jobs people are in. So what we did was follow the same people over time. So we followed 300 couples over time. And we said, of that group of couples who are all working, all having babies, what predicts why some do well and some don't? So there's no control group that wasn't having a baby. We were investing all of our money into tracking these folks over time. And my ultimate question was, what's predicting the best outcomes for kids? What's predicting the best outcomes for parents? So it wasn't a controlled sort of comparison because we weren't doing an intervention. We were trying to understand developmental process.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Okay. So now that you've set the stage here, why do some parents thrive and some parents struggle based on what you've seen yourself?
Okay. So I want to start here because I think, as a psychologist and who hangs out with a lot of parenting researchers, we tend to focus on telling parents how to be better parents, or what are the things we know about parenting and that are good for kids. And we very rarely say, what are those things outside of parents' lives that make it really hard to do the things they know they should be doing or want to do as parents? Like most of us know, many of us know, or can be quickly told, these are good things to do with an infant, and this is how you interact. But when you're at a job or when you're in a context where you are completely depleted by the time you come home, or beat up, or, not physically, but just sort of feeling like to come home and have to be present and aware and engaged and warm with an infant is really difficult. And so I'm trying to understand or basically make us think beyond parents just be better parents to how do we as a society and employers and CEOs create jobs that really eat people up versus create jobs where people feel a sense of belonging, a sense of respect, a sense of contributing to something. And then those folks come home in very different mindsets and in very different ways. So our data, because we went back again and again and again and again, we got multiple indicators of work and how work changed over time. So it was not huge things. It wasn't like, oh, I have, childcare on site, or they pay, it was things like, in the book, there's all sorts of examples. My boss actually allowed me to sit down at the register, even though it's against the rules to sit down at the register when you're pregnant. But my boss broke the rule for me. Like, that sounds like peanuts, right? That sounds like nothing. But those sorts of things where that you recognize you're having a hard time, someone's there to offer a little bit of support. Those sorts of things again and again and again change the climate of that workplace. And that sounds like a no-brainer, but the idea that employers could actually make these fairly small fixes in a very short period of time is something we don't spend enough time talking about. I think employers feel like it needs to be some huge, policy change or a huge investment. And, we had some employers who didn't even know their fathers became fathers. The fathers didn't tell them. They don't trust them. They don't want them to know. Like, that's a weird workplace, right? If you're not even sharing that piece of your life at work, something's going on there that makes it then really hard to feel good about work or to feel like you're contributing. And all of those things that sort of make sense. Sometimes I've gotten questions like, well, this just seems obvious. Good parenting leads to good kid outcomes. And said, no, what's not obvious, or what's the thing we haven't spent much time on, is you can actually enhance child development by changing workplaces. You don't just have to change parents. You can change workplaces to be more conducive for human development. And then it spills over to kids and relationships.
And when we address that question with listeners of, is this research applicable to spouses? Is it fair to say, and please tell me if I'm not summarizing this correctly, that managers can simply treat their employees like human beings that they care for, and just by doing that and having that mindset, that in itself will lead to employees being less stressed and ultimately better parents?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've overlooked the role of supervisors. And I also have, my heart goes out. Many supervisors are right in the middle, right? You've got your workers down here. You've got people up here who are watching the clock and watching the money, telling you how to behave and how you're supposed to behave to your employees.
Right.
Oftentimes supervisors break the rules to support their employees, which is they can't sort of admit what they're doing to the upper level, but they do things and give people time off even when it's not supposed to be on the books. And, I talked with one, my work before this study was often with sort of the employers, and the idea that you can empower your employees, or you can give is just not something that's currently in their training or that they're allowed to do, but many want to do it. And again, employees can also usually tell you exactly what the things that would make a difference. I've got so many, like we had some folks who had jobs with mandatory overtime, and mandatory overtime is not going to go away. It's been around for a really long time.
Which is what?
Mandatory overtime is basically, you can be told on any given day that to get this product out, you need to stay for 2 extra hours today. It's perfectly legal. And if you don't, there can be sanctions. So you can lose your next day's pay. You can lose a vacation day. There's different policies that folks have. And I was working with this one company. This is a meat packing company. And imagine being a parent. It's 4:00. You're supposed to be done. And they say you got to stay 2 extra hours. You're supposed to be picking up your kid. And so they asked me to come in, and I worked with these, and I said, how do we do this? We got 2 problems here. I get that sometimes the work needs to be done, but there's also people need to get home to their kids. And the workers had a whole plan. They were like, we can do this. We can switch days. I'll take Mondays, Tuesday, Wednesdays, and this next week and certain days. Some of them want the overtime because they want the money, but they need to know ahead of time. So the employers were so nervous about this. We made it a pilot. I said, we'll just try it for 3 months. We'll see how it goes, see what problems happen. The employees wanted it to happen, so you can be sure it happened. It worked beautifully. They set it up. But the fear of sort of empowering your employees to solve the problems, to make work better, which is actually the easiest solution of all, is an interesting thing that supervisors and employers have. That there's sometimes a distrust that your employee is going to take advantage when in fact they're the best problem solvers because they're living it.
So if you're listening to this and let's say you have a job where your supervisor is all over you, right? They're creating the kinds of conditions that we talk about, that is something that's hard to then go home and be a great parent. And those could be high income jobs too. I mean, there's bad bosses everywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you're that person and you're not the supervisor, what is it that you can do to perhaps make the kinds of changes with your boss that will make it better for you, aside from just quitting?
Right. And a lot of people can't quit, or even the thought of quitting when the rest of your life is so crazy. It's not something people even consider.
Right.
So usually, when we sort of work on it from that end, I think I would work with, it depends on the organization, and it depends on the kind of work people are doing, because they're going to be asking for different things. When I've worked sometimes with employees, and the other things that organizations are very worried about are unions. So they're afraid that if employees get together and make a solution or propose something, then they're going to want a union, and then things are going to, but for all sorts of, that's another whole conversation.
Yeah.
In fact, most of the folks I've worked with are so stressed and busy. The last thing they're thinking about is having time to unionize and whatever. They're thinking about what are the things that they need to do that would make work easier and what solutions they have. So I often will say to employees, if there can be a group of you at lunchtime that just say, invite your supervisor in and say, can we just talk about some things we think would make us more productive and make our lives better? Like there's this problem, ideally I'd like to work with both the employee and the supervisor at the same time. But if you're really just having to figure out your own work scenario, people rarely ask, especially low-income workers. So I've done studies with low-income workers and high-income workers. And when I've asked folks, so what would make a difference? What could change things? What could make things better? More educated folks will say things like, I need paid leave and I need flexibility. And they have their list of exactly what they need and they go in. And the low-income workers will say, well, maybe I should sleep less. I probably am not as organized as I should be. And even when prompted, I'm like, what could work do? How could work make your life easier? And it's not even, work is just work. It's not that it is something. So first it's planting the seed that, work could be better. There are probably things you could suggest or think about that would actually make a difference. But I think when I work with an employee, you have to be, your context, if your supervisor is going to flip out or if your supervisor, and so then it becomes, and what's happening right now and what we know because of such the low unemployment rates, folks are leaving. They're like, I don't need to put up with this. So in some ways, a lot of the questions I'm getting are much more from employers who are like, we're losing people left and right. What do we have to do? Tomorrow, what can we do? I'm like, okay, well, what you could do is have a lunch for your employees and ask them what would make their lives easier. They'll tell you in 5 minutes, 5 things you could do that are probably going to cost you hardly anything. Like letting them figure out their flexibility schedules or giving them some autonomy in what they do. And I want to be studying it all as it happens because those are the experiments, right? Those are really like, okay, we're going to institute this. Let's do some pre-post stuff. Let's really see if it makes a difference.
As you're describing this, it just occurred to me that this is happening at all income levels. So the many times the employer's solution, this is my experience, I don't have nearly the same amount of experience that you have, is hey, let's have a pizza party or hey, more money, we'll just give you more money. But it sounds to me like it's not necessarily more money that's more valuable, but it could perhaps be more time and flexibility would be more valuable. Is that the case?
Right. I think I think the concern, remember, I'm studying parents with young kids. So for them, the most valuable entity is time. Because they just don't have enough time to sort of do it, and some flexibility, right? So because kids get sick or you got to do the pickup or, can I go in earlier and leave earlier so then my partner can go in later and come later and then we can save money on childcare, all sorts of just arrangements that make it more affordable and give you some time. So the question of what the currency is, I think employers often think money is the only currency. There's a lot of other currency that people need to be creative about in thinking about how to make workers' lives better. And the bottom line is workers usually know.
Can you give me, let's just say, 3 low-hanging fruit, 3 examples of things that employers can do quite easily to improve the work environment? Right.
One is giving folks some control over what they do. So one example is my favorite example, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review article, is the job where one employee had the most autonomy in our study, the most autonomy was a woman who worked in a candle packing factory. Do you remember that example?
I do.
Sure okay.
I do, but refresh it for our listeners.
Okay. So there was a woman. So people were asking a lot when I was doing our early studies, what is this autonomy thing and what does it look like? And how do you create autonomy in a job that's just a factory job or whatever? And so I was like, well, I'm going to figure this out. So I just went and picked the top 5 people in my study that had the highest autonomy scores at very low income, what you consider not stimulating, exciting jobs, right? And I just looked at what they did and read all their data and listened to all their stories because we had qualitative and quantitative data. And this one mom basically said, well, she packed candle boxes, packed shipments for candles. And so she started in these writing little notes, these cute little notes, and started sending extra scents to people. Say, I've noticed you like the vanillas a lot. So here's 2 new scents we have, and my name's whatever. And she sent things out. And then clients started requesting that she fill their boxes. And so her boss came to him like, why are people asking for you to fill their boxes? And she said, well, because I do all this kind of stuff. I made these cute little cards and I put them in. And he's like, now he could have been really ticked, right? He could have been like, but instead he was like, that's brilliant. Wow. Like you basically create, you've given a face to a faceless client was the language he used. It was very businessy kind of language, but she was thrilled. And then he had her do workshops with all the other people who were packers. And then she got a promotion. So this is a job that she just added a little of herself to and was rewarded for it. Right. Another example of autonomy, like a lot of our workers, a lot of people in these jobs are healthcare workers. And whether you are sort of a janitor in a hospital or doing, home health aid kind of work, which actually is pretty autonomous work, right? Where it can be, or there can be someone over your head. Like some companies actually make you have a camera on the whole time, right? So it's complete distrust of what's happening and complete versus other ones that sort of allow you to engage in the groups. So what one company did was basically, these home health aides are with this person more than anybody else, but they're never at health team meetings. They're never there to sort of say what they're, seeing in the home or how the client's doing. And this one agency just said, well, we can invite them to these meetings. It professionalized these minimum wage jobs in a way that these individuals could sort of come to a meeting and share their experiences with this person day in and day out, which provided huge insight into what needed to be happening next. So these are not, they typically can be jobs that we just kind of like, yep, get that, but there's easy, important ways to add autonomy and respect that didn't cost them 1 cent more, right? This employee got 1 hour a week where she actually could go to these meetings and she was empowered. She was like, I get to attend these meetings with these doctors and nurses.
And throughout your research just has found simply that when somebody has the kind of job where they have more autonomy, they have more say, they feel empowered, that they're going to, and in turn, be better parents. So before we get to the spousal, is it applicable to spouses? Can you explain what it looks like in school? So I know you talked about this in your book, but what are the actual outcomes that you can that are quantifiably defendable to say, hey, they are actually better learners because of the work environment they were in?
Are you talking about the kids being better learners?
Yes.
Yes. So we are psychologists and clinicians, so we're good at assessments. So we did our own assessments with kids. So there's actual standardized reading, math, literacy things, and they're all, for 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. So we did basically in-home testing with all of these kids. And then we also got teacher reports. So we got their, the kind of report cards you get in the first grade, but we got copies of all those. We got teachers' reports of their behavior and social skills and that sort of thing. So we had very objective data on that. It wasn't parents reporting on how their kids were doing. It was teachers and us assessing how these kids were doing. So so that's what we measure. That's
important.
Yes, it's really important because parents are biased and parents. And I think having an objective assessment tool that's just how are these kids doing academically. Actually, I was more interested in how these kids were doing socially and socio-emotionally. So we had a lot of data on kids' social skills and getting along with others and that sort of thing. But I have a colleague who's a real cognitive development in kids, and he's like, measure this cognitive stuff, which was actually a really good thing to do. So
were you able to dive into the SEL stuff, the social emotional stuff?
Yeah, actually, the first paper that we did was on kids' behavioral sort of problems, behavior problems, and social skills. These were assessed by teachers. And so what we found was that during that first year of life, dads, and our data, what was really interesting is it came out as strongly for dads as it did for moms. So dads and moms data. So the first year of child's life, fathers and moms who reported more autonomy, more sense of control at their job, predicted more warm and engaged parenting, and predicted 6 years later, kids doing better on their behavior, having fewer behavior problems and more social skills in the classroom.
Wow. Okay. So we know now that this is a good job defined as we've defined it so far in this podcast impacts you as a parent. Yeah. Do you think that this is applicable to being a good spouse?
Absolutely. So The processes that get from work to kids is all the stuff in the middle, right? Is the parents and partners and how they're getting along. So before we had our kid outcome data, we did a lot of analyses with our data looking at how work was affecting parents' mental health, how it was affecting their relationship quality, how it affected how much they fought, how it affected their sense of their partnership with their partners. So we have a lot of couple data and a lot of division of labor data, and we have all that kind of stuff. So, and basically, the same, it's sort of just one step shorter than getting all the way to the kids. When you come home, the most typical behavior we saw was actually not high levels of conflict, but high levels of disengagement. So you come home feeling pummeled or not feeling good or whatever. There was some data that predicted more conflict, but the much stronger findings were just checking out, putting on the TV. I don't want to talk right now. I don't want to engage. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to go out. I got to recover. And that, any given day, we all have one of those days, or we all have a day where we're cranky, whatever. The issue is when it happens again and again and again and again and again, the sort of things that set up. So but there's buffers for that, right? So you can have a lousy day at work and still come home and not be great. But if you've got other social support, so it's not just about the couple, but you've got, parents or friends or whatever that are sort of buffering some of those effects of work. What was really important there were some gender differences for men were their coworker relationships at work. So they could have a lousy job, but if they felt like they had buddies at work and they had coworkers who had their back and they had coworkers that it buffered a lot of the negativity that was the other part of their job. For women, it was less important. Coworkers matter, but not as much in terms of their mental health. And the key is all of these, these work conditions affect your mental health. They affect your depression, your anxiety, your overload, your stress. And those we all know. That part we know affects relationships, right? And affects what's going on. The idea that work is something you can't control, you just have to figure out a way to block it out or whatever for your relationship, to me overlooks this much bigger issue of why do workplaces have no responsibility for human development, for how people are doing. Like you're spending all this time there. And I just think that argument gets overlooked all the time. And so they're like, that's not our job. People come to work and they do their job. And I'm like, but, I appeal to often a much higher level, not just return on investment. And I can make the whole argument. If you're good to your workers, they're going to stay longer and you're not going to lose them. And they're going to, all that good stuff, which the business folks have done. But the other return on investment argument is, do you care about your society? And I know this sounds dramatic, but do you care about the next generation of kids? Right now, we've done this social experiment for over 50 years where women have gone back to work in droves. We have no leave policy to speak of. It's all piecemeal. Right now, some places have paid, so we're following that. But compared to Canada, compared to Europe, we have 12 weeks. And that social experiment, I think, is playing out when we look at our child outcome data. We are of the richest countries in the world. Our kids are doing the worst on almost every measure compared to all the other industrialized countries. We have more money, but our kids are doing worse. Why is that? One of the main things we differ on is that first year of life, which we also know is when brain synapses are exploding. The most brain development that's ever going to happen is happening in that first year. And what do? We send parents back to work stressed out after 12 weeks, if they're lucky. And then we can't afford great childcare we have not taken care of parents during the most important time for the development of our next generation. So this sounds very dramatic, I know, but I think it's really true. And I think that I have way more sway with older CEOs than I do with younger CEOs. Something about being a little wiser and a little like, what's my legacy here? What am I leaving for the next generation, as opposed to what am I leaving for my own kid? What are we doing for the next generation? I think is a much bigger, important argument.
And there's really
spouting.
No, this is spot on, because paternity leave is extremely rare, and even if it's there, the societal norms are that you don't take it. And frankly, I'm from a small rural town in Ohio. I would think if I took that, I would think less of myself. I would think that I'm not a good father or husband or whatever, despite the fact that, exactly. And a buddy of mine that runs the company of dads talks about care days, meaning just days that companies can allot where they have to care for their child. You get sick, but your child gets sick. And it occurred to me as you're describing this that as a former educator, you can basically gauge or predict, I should say, the outcome of an SAT score based on socioeconomics. And it's really frightening because the kids that are in upper income environments, homes, do better on the SAT. And when you kind of look broadly speaking, when you have higher income households, you have the means to buy time, the means to have only perhaps one working parent instead of two. And all of these things add up.
Or buy nannies or buy high quality childcare, right? I mean, I think we've not spent much time looking at those disparities in that first year, and that can you imagine what we do to parents? You have a baby and you're back at work 3 weeks after having a child. Just like imagining how heartless that is. And it's because there's sort of this notion, it's your kid, you decided to do it, go for it. Whereas in these other countries, it's like, this is our country. This is the next generation. This is what's going to keep us going. And there's just no sense of sort of, I think, sort of the next generation. So why we're not caring for, why we're so stingy about the things that seem so important in the first year to me. I just can't fathom it.
You said that you had data that showed how the workplace impacts, spousal relationships, but then you started to dive into like division of labor and arguing. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So again, in the study that we talk about in this book, it's lower income families or working class families. And, but the same pattern happens, but more often with low income families, one of the ways they manage childcare is they do split shifts. Right. So someone does 7 to 3, someone does 3 to 11, or someone does night shift, or someone whatever. And interestingly, when that happens, there's a much more equal division of labor. In fact, dads are doing almost the same amount of childcare as moms.
I have to say that is what my wife and I did in the first couple years of our marriage. Our child was a blessing. And during the day, she went to work. I worked in the evenings and went to grad school at night. And so we just switched. And the division of labor was absolutely equal. And it wasn't planned. It wasn't as if I had this epiphany. I was certainly influenced by societal norms.
Conditions out here force equity at home. That's what happens.
You got it. Yeah. That's interesting.
It's fascinating. And so it can happen, right? There can be equality when it's forced into the situation. So not surprisingly, in our data, whether it's our working class families or our other professional families, it's always unequal pretty much, with women doing more than men. And the expectation, so there's multiple reasons for that. I mean, that there's, societal norms and women feeling like they're supposed to, there's, excluding fathers because I can do it better. There's workplaces that actually, there's, when men become fathers, they tend to work more hours. This whole provider thing kicks in, and they got, and so we've got such big social norms that unless structures are put in place. So for example, in Sweden, when they had started their first paid leave, it was either parent could take it, but they found out that only women were taking it. And so then they created I can't imagine this could ever happen in the United States, but they basically created a new policy that men had certain number of months that they could take. And if they didn't take it, the wife couldn't take it. You just lost it. So if he didn't take it, you lost it. Then they started using it.
You think? Yeah. I can't think of a husband in his right mind that would not take it at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
If it was optional, like one of you could take it, it was more often, not always, more often the woman took it. Whereas when they split it, but that's fascinating. That's a country saying, we want fathers involved with their kids. We're going to create policies that kind of make it happen. That's saying as a value, this is what we really value in this country. We're going to make it happen with our policies. That's not what we're doing here. Or it's not our value. Our value is you take care of your own kid. I'll take care of my kid. You shouldn't have a kid if you can't afford to pay for that kid. Only rich people get to have kids. That's extreme. But I have had legislators say, I live in Massachusetts, and we were at a hearing once, and I brought some of the moms who had participated in our study because it was talking about paid leave. And one of the older white gentlemen said, well, my wife stayed at home when I had my kids. And if you can't afford to have a kid, you shouldn't be having a kid. And one of the moms that I was about ready to respond with all this data, blah, blah, blah. And she was just like, excuse me. And she stood up and she just gave it to him. She said, I work full time. I work paid minimum wage because that's all you'll pay for a minimum wage job. I deserve to have a child as much as you deserve to have a child. I mean, she just ramped him up one side and down the other. And she said, do you know how much minimum wage is? She had the money. She told him how much she made a month. She told him, it was like, it was just, he had no clue. No clue.
Yeah. Well, 80% of people who receive government assistance have full-time jobs.
Yeah.
And I, one of the challenges we have at Modern Husbands is that when we bring up like inequities at home, like the division of labor oftentimes falls unfairly on women. Unless we explain ourselves, they get the sense that like we're almost attacking our men ourselves. And
right.
What the research says is actually men are happier and the marriages are better when men chip in. I shouldn't say chip in. That's the wrong language. But when there is a fair division of labor at home, it actually makes men happier. And like there's this notion that men don't want to be fathers. Like there are these societal norms, and I'm guilty. I wish I could say that I'm perfect, but trust me, I am learning. And there's something ingrained in at least me where when I had my first child, it was like, all right, I got to really work. And I spent 15 years working 60 to 80 hours a week. I had a bleeding ulcer before I was 40. And it was just something about this mentality of the culture that we live in. I would have much rather had a lot of that time back to spend more time with my children. So when we talk about these things, we advocate for these things. It's not just to help women and our spouses, but it's also to help men and marriages and parenting. And so speaking of things being misconstrued, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the important thing is patterns that get set up in the early, years of marriage, actually, and in the early years of parenthood are patterns that get maintained. So there's data that fathers who are very involved early on are the fathers that are involved. In fact, fathers of children, I don't even know if this data would still come out this way, but this was like in the 90s. Fathers of children, fathers who were born by C-section were more involved when the baby was born and are more involved like years later because the pattern got set up early. The dad was involved because mom couldn't do as much care because she had had a C-section. Like that was an interesting finding. The same thing with the marriage, patterns that get set up, literally things like Ted Houston did some of this work. Who makes the coffee in the morning? Who cleans up? Patterns that get established in the first 6 months of marriage are the most solid patterns that are maintained like throughout a marriage. So I'm always telling my students, like, be careful when you get married. Make sure if you get married that you're being very intentional about how you're dividing up chores. Like who's the person who does the laundry in the first 6 months is the person that's doing the laundry way down the road. Or if you're sharing it, you tend to be sharing it. But those patterns, parenting patterns, division of labor patterns need to be thoughtfully constructed at the beginning because then we just get into the roteness of it.
When back to your research and your book being shared, and then it really started to take off. It was in Harvard Business Review and then the Washington Post. As I understand it, some of the way that you were sharing the information or the information itself was being misconstrued. Yeah. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was surprised. Some of the comments from both articles were, oh, great, another study showing how parents should feel guilty. Oh, great, another study, saying it's all parents' fault why kids aren't doing well in the first grade. And those were the ones that sort of cut to the quick because the whole point of this research was to take it off of parents, to say it's amazing what parents are actually able to do given the constraints and the demands out there. So the book and the point of the article is that workplaces could take some responsibility here, and workplaces, especially during that really sensitive first year, let's do something. Let's make it easier to be a parent then and contribute not only to your workers, but society. Like that's the argument, and that it's not always on parents. And I've known so many and met so many parents in this study. First of all, I've never met a parent that's not in love with their child. I have not. I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews. Have I met parents who are too exhausted to do what they want to do with their child, or who are too depleted to actually engage the way they know they should be engaging or want to be engaging? Yes. but not that don't love their kids. So the idea that we don't recognize and support how hard it is when that transition happens, I think is a sad state of affairs, because we're just, not that other countries have figured it out. And I'm convinced we don't have great data on this. And that's what I'd love to like have someone who does very large meta-analyses do this, but to really say, is our decline in kid outcomes, in some of the World Health data, our decline on our kids' cognitive outcomes and social outcomes and basic sense of well-being, is that decline over the years, and why it hasn't declined in other countries? What social policies have or have not changed in that time? I'm betting it's one of these. I bet leave has something to do with it.
Which I've always found it to be frustrating and a problem that needs to be tackled from a non-political perspective, because when politicians are want to emphasize economic growth, which I'm a capitalist, I believe that that's beneficial. When you look at the long-term impact of these things that you've discussed, whether it's just being time to be a better parent, a better workplace environment, or investments into more equitable education, et cetera, they actually help the economy in the long run. Yet you have like this indifference on one side of the aisle where they don't recognize that connection, or perhaps they don't see the value in making those investments because the return on an investment is too far down the line.
The long term, that I think that's a huge part of the problem. And we have some really good data that shows some of these long term, but it's not what politicians are looking for, right? It's not. So it is, I think, the question about who makes these decisions, or how do we even think about these decisions? I just feel like a lot of Americans don't even think that work is adjustable or work is malleable. It's just is what it is. And I got to figure out what to do with it. I think because of what's happened with the pandemic, or whenever you're in a situation where there's not enough workers and there's, too many jobs to be filled, it's a moment. Like we may have a moment right now,
right?
Where I do have employers going, how can I make them stay for longer than a month? How can I make them? I'm like, well, let's think about that. There's multiple ways. Have you asked them? Oh, what a novel idea! Should just have you asked them. That's the first thing I ask. Have you literally sat down and asked them, why do you think people leave?
Well, and you hit the nail on the head when you said it's a moment, right? Because economic cycles oftentimes happen over 10 or 20 year periods. And we have been, take COVID out of the picture, because that was an anomaly. We have been in a recovering economy, and now in a strong economy. You could argue overheated economy that has been 10 years in the making, or actually more like 15 years in the making. And every economist knows that when you get to the point where you're fighting some inflation and where there's more jobs than there are people, that is the moment where labor has the upper hand, where changes can be made to have better compensation packages, more flexible work schedules, whatever it may be. Yeah. But when that moment passes, and trust me, we all know it will, there's going to be a recession. It's inevitable. Right. That moment's gone. So I'm glad you said it that way. So I want to end, we like to give our listeners just kind of, one takeaway that can be applicable to their lives. So let's assume that the listeners actually don't have kids, but they are married. Understanding what you do, what is it that you want them to walk away understanding that they can easily apply to their marriages or relationships?
I want folks to understand that you really can't leave work at work. We call work like the long arm of the job. It reaches into families. It reaches into relationships. It reaches into your mental health. And first, just acknowledging that it's not something that's wrong with me. It's not something that's wrong with our relationship. It's that there's forces out there that are making it really hard for me to come home and be the person that I want to be. And that might mean at some point a big discussion about, do I need to switch my jobs? Or it might be, is there someone at work, or is there a way to refinagle that work thing? Is it really that immutable, or is there something I could actually do to make that part of my life better? And we don't think about that. We think about going to therapy for our relationship. And that's not a bad thing, or for our mental health. And you do need all those coping mechanisms. But the idea that it's something about us, that something's wrong with us, as opposed to you're spending 40 to 50 hours a week at a place that's demoralizing and not filling your cup, let's say. That's the problem.
Well, your insight was incredible today. I greatly enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, it was fun.
I knew I would. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcasts and share the Modern Husbands podcast with your friends. A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Please be on the lookout for new and exciting announcements on modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.